The Galactic Council banned human weapons, then secretly copied them all. The gavel struck the stone platform before I finished standing up. I am Captain Mara Voss, United Nations Galactic Liaison Officer, and I had traveled 6 days through deep space to stand in that chamber and make a case I had spent 3 months preparing. I did not get to make it. Councillor Shenvath, the presiding arbiter of the session, looked down at me from his elevated seat with those pale silver eyes and informed me in his slow and careful voice that the vote had taken place at dawn, before the formal session opened, and that the result was 31 votes in favor and 2 against. 2 species had voted against Resolution 7 Omega. We were one of them. The grand convocation chamber was built to impress. Vaulted ceilings of pale crystal caught light from 3 artificial suns suspended outside the station's observation windows and scattered it across the speaker's floor in long, shifting shapes. The delegates curved above me in their semicircle of seats, 33 recognized species of the Galactic Council, some breathing filtered gases through personal masks, some with physiologies that bore no resemblance to what a human would call a face, and all of them watching me with the particular quality of attention that belongs to a group of people who have already made a decision and are now waiting to see how you receive it. I had spent 3 months preparing my argument. I had every clause of the resolution memorized. I had built my rebuttal the way an engineer builds a bridge, piece by piece, tested under each kind of pressure I could imagine. I did not use a single word of it. My aide, a young officer named Owen Hartley, touched my elbow and suggested in a very quiet voice that we might consider leaving before the situation became uncomfortable. I told him, without turning, to stay where he was. If they wanted me gone, they would have to say so directly. Shenvath said so directly. He did it with great care and apparent warmth, which was harder to sit through than open hostility would have been. He told me the council understood this was a difficult moment. He told me the resolution was not about distrust. He said humanity's contributions to galactic civilization were deeply valued and formally recognized. He then told me that within 30 days, all human weapons above the defined threshold were to be surrendered to a joint council retrieval team, cataloged, and archived at a neutral facility under council supervision. I asked him what cataloged meant specifically. He said it meant documented, scientifically assessed, preserved for the historical record. I asked who would be conducting the scientific assessment. He said the appropriate research bodies of the council. I kept my face perfectly calm. I have practiced that calm for a long time. You learn it quickly when your profession puts you across the table from beings who can read a human nervous system the way most people read a page. You learn to hold a thought so still that nothing registers on the surface. What I was holding was the understanding that Shenvath had just told me everything I needed to know, not with the resolution, with the word studied. Here is what the Galactic Council had never fully understood about human weapons. It was not the hardware. Every civilization in the known galaxy had hardware. The Vraxi hegemony had energy discharge arrays capable of removing the surface layer of a moon in an afternoon of sustained operation. The Theresi maintained gravitational compression systems listed in their own industrial registry as mining equipment, which was technically correct and practically a significant understatement. The Veldorians had a biological containment technology that I am bound by treaty not to describe in detail, and which I prefer not to describe by personal choice. None of them frightened the galaxy the way we did. What made us different was not a single weapon, or a single system, or even a single class of technology. It was the accumulated product of 10,000 years of conflict, loss, revision, and painful learning. We had fought each other, across every terrain and every condition, and every engagement had produced information, and every piece of information had been carried into the next design, and the design after that, and the 1,000 designs that followed. We did not simply have weapons. We had a science of conflict, so densely layered after so many centuries that it looked, from the outside, like instinct. It was not instinct. It was memory. It was history. It was the specific angle of a wound and the exact failure mode of a mechanism, accumulated across a span of time that no other species in the Council had spent at war with itself. The engagement at Kepler's Reach was the clearest example the galaxy had to study. 14 months before the vote, a single human destroyer called the GES Franklin, under the command of a captain named Gerald Howe, had encountered a Vraxi hegemony patrol fleet of 40 warships. The Vraxi had been raiding civilian transport lanes. Howe was under orders to observe and report. Gerald Howe did not observe and report. What happened over 6 hours was documented obsessively by every Council intelligence service afterward. Howe had used railgun fire not to destroy, but to shape the space ahead of the enemy. He fired into empty corridors, creating debris zones that forced specific avoidance maneuvers, each of which he had calculated and prepositioned to intercept. He targeted not the main drives or weapons bays, as every other species' tactical doctrine would dictate, but the navigation processing systems, because human engineers had learned, through very specific and very expensive experience, that a crew uncertain of their own position makes compounding errors faster than any external damage can produce. 6 hours in, the Vraxi fleet was not destroyed. It was confused and separated and entirely unable to coordinate. The Franklin had hull damage in 4 sections and was running on reserve power. She was still flying. The Council had seen this and felt afraid. They had concluded that what frightened them should be removed. They had not thought carefully enough about what they were asking for. I picked up my data pad. I signed the compliance acknowledgement. I pressed my thumb to the verification seal, and the panel turned green. Around the chamber, the atmosphere shifted in a way that told me several delegates had been holding their breath. Shenvath allowed himself a small expression of relief. I looked at him and said, very quietly, "You have just asked us to hand you the instruction manual." He tilted his head. "I'm not certain I understand what you mean, Captain." "You will," I said. Owen followed me out of the chamber and the doors sealed behind us. We walked 3 full corridors before he said anything. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was better than all right. I told him to arrange a secure channel to Earth Command the moment we were back aboard our ship. I told him we had 30 days, and I intended to use every one of them correctly. He asked what we were going to tell Earth Command. I thought about Shenvath's careful face and the words studied, and the hunger barely hidden behind 31 votes. I thought about what happens, and has always happened, when someone receives a blueprint without the history behind it. "We are going to tell them," I said, "that the Galactic Council has just made an expensive mistake, and that we have been given an extraordinary opportunity to be generous about it." Owen did not ask what that meant. He had worked with me long enough to know that when I said generous, it was worth paying very close attention to every word that came afterward. The crates were labeled Restricted Historical Artifacts, which was the Council Logistics Department's preferred phrasing. I had submitted a request to use more accurate language. The request was declined on grounds of diplomatic sensitivity. I filed a note about the declination, because I file notes about everything, which is either a professional strength or a personal condition depending on who you ask. My name is Staff Sergeant Dion Achterberg, Human Compliance Officer for Weapons Vault Delta 9, and for 30 days I was the man responsible for making sure every item on the approved surrender list got packaged, documented, and transferred correctly within the legal window. What that also meant in practice was that I spent 30 days standing in a vault watching alien scientists behave in ways that were almost professionally insulting in their transparency. And I am going to tell you about it in specific detail because I believe the details matter. Day 1 was entirely unremarkable. The Council's initial inspection team arrived, verified credentials, conducted a 40-minute walkthrough of the vault, and departed, professional and appropriately boring. Day 3 was not. The second team included 3 Thuresi scientists, 2 Veldorian archivists, and a Vreth diplomatic observer whose official function I was never able to determine to my satisfaction, because he did not appear to be archiving anything or conducting any assessment I could identify. He stood in various positions throughout the vault and watched. That was, apparently, the full scope of his contribution. The Thuresi researchers were tall and narrow-framed, with wide flat eyes and long fingers that were always in motion, touching surfaces with the gentle, continuous contact of someone who reads through sensation rather than sight. They moved through the vault with the focused energy of people who had been thinking about this particular room for a long time before they arrived in it. The Veldorian archivists were carrying equipment that stopped me cold the moment I identified it. They had material composition scanners with them, not the standard documentation type used to catalog an object for a historical record. Fabrication-grade scanners, the kind with resolution sufficient to determine manufacturing tolerances and precise alloy compositions, the kind that is useful not when you want to describe something, but when you want to build it. I logged this and submitted the log to my supervising officer. She informed me that the Council's documentation mandate was broadly defined, and that fabrication-grade scanning fell within its permitted scope. I asked at what point detailed fabrication scanning crossed the line into reverse engineering. She told me to keep logging and to stop generating administrative complexity. I kept logging. I moved the administrative complexity to a separate encrypted file and began routing everything directly to Captain Voss, as she had instructed. On day 5, a third inspection team arrived without scheduling notice. Their stated purpose was supplemental inspection. 4 individuals carrying credentials I had not encountered before. When I ran their institutional affiliation through the Council database that evening, it returned as a Veldorian Materials Engineering Research Institute. Not an archival body, not a Council documentation authority, a research institute, the kind that designs and manufactures things. I filed a formal report through the standard channel. It came back marked noted and filed. I would come to think of those 3 words as the most quietly enraging phrase in any administrative language. The days in the vault settled into their own rhythm after that. Each morning the teams distributed themselves through the aisles of crates and equipment, and each morning I found something new to add to my encrypted log. The way the Thuresi researchers would spend not minutes but hours on single items, studying angles and surfaces with the investment of people who intended to understand something completely, not merely describe it. The consistency with which the Veldorian archivists returned to the same systems on consecutive days, running their scanners over identical components again and again, with the patience of people, extracting one very precise number from a complicated source. There was a young Thuresi researcher who carried a small personal notebook and wrote with a stylus. Long, careful lines of Thuresi script, nothing automated, nothing that backed up to a shared network. He wrote this way every day for the full 3 weeks of inspections. I watched him do it, and I thought about the kind of information you want in a format that no network can access when you are supposed to be participating in a shared archival exercise on behalf of the full Council membership. The questions were what confirmed everything I had been logging. On day 11, one of the Veldorian archivists turned away from the 20 autocannon barrel assembly she had been scanning and asked me, in the casual tone of someone making light conversation, what the manufacturing tolerance was on the internal rifling. I looked at her for a moment before answering. That specification is not included in the surrender documentation, I said. She said it was for context, background information for the archive. I told her she was welcome to file a formal information request through the appropriate channel. She smiled the slow Veldorian way, patient and entirely untroubled, and returned to her scanning, but she had asked the question, and I could not stop thinking about it. The internal rifling tolerance is not a number you need to catalog a weapon for a historical record. It is a number you need to reproduce one. Not accurately enough to display it in an archive, accurately enough to fire it. That evening I calmed Mara Voss on the encrypted personal channel. She picked up immediately. I told her everything I had been building in the log, the fabrication scanners, the unauthorized teams and their institute affiliations, the handwritten notes, the rifling question. There was a silence on the channel long enough that I checked twice to confirm the connection was still active. Then she said, "They are not archiving these, Dion." It was not a question, but I said, "No, they are not." She told me to continue logging and to route everything directly to her, bypassing the standard channel completely. She gave me no instruction to challenge the teams or interrupt their work or slow the process in any way. I did not need her to explain why. Whatever was set in motion was larger than the vault, and the correct role inside the vault was to observe, document, and maintain patience. Patience was not my natural state, but doing the job correctly was. On day 17, I had a conversation with the young Theresi note-taker that I have gone back to many times since. He had been reading through the technical summary for a fragmentation device for close to an hour when I came to stand nearby. After a while he looked up and asked me, in careful but competent English, whether humans had always used this specific alloy grade for explosive casings, or whether the current version had been arrived at through iteration. I told him it was the 14th iteration of the design. The first 13 each had failure modes that made them unsuitable. He asked what the failure modes were. I said several of them were in the early direction. I left a short pause, which is not the direction you want when you are the one holding it. He thought about this carefully, and then asked what the thermal coefficient of the current alloy was under sustained mechanical stress. I told him that was a proprietary specification not covered in the surrender documentation and suggested the formal request process. He wrote something in his notebook anyway. I fully expected nothing less. That evening, I sent Voss a detailed note on the conversation and added my assessment of what the pattern of questions described as a whole. Someone at an undisclosed location was working to build a fragmentation device from the surrendered schematics. They had most of what they needed. They were missing the material behavior data that would tell them exactly how the casing needed to perform during the specific thermal event of a detonation. Without those numbers, they could build something that appeared correct and probably functioned correctly under controlled test conditions. Under conditions of rapid temperature change, operational variance, or environmental stress, the casing material would behave in ways the incomplete specification would give them no warning about. Voss responded with 4 words, "Keep watching, I will." The final day arrived without ceremony. 47 crates, packed and tagged and sealed. The retrieval team arrived at 8 in the morning and began loading. I stood at the exit checkpoint and matched each container's physical tag against the shipping manifest on my screen. At container 31, I stopped. I went back through the manifest. I checked again. I ran the confirmation scan a second time. 23 containers were listed for the neutral archive at Station Verath 12, the agreed and legally required destination under the terms of Resolution 7 Omega. The remaining 24 were listed for Veldorian Research Station Omicron. I ran the name through the Council database. It returned as a materials science facility, privately funded, 14 years in operation, affiliated with the Veldorian Research Commission. Not a neutral facility, not a council archive, not accessible to the full membership, a private research installation. I took a full screenshot of the manifest with the timestamp and authorization codes and destination fields completely visible. I sent it to Voss with 4 words, "They are already there." Then I signed the compliance closure document, because it was my legal responsibility. and I turned off the vault lights for the last time, and I walked out. I thought, walking down the corridor toward the transit bay, about the Council passing Resolution 7 Omega because they feared what we could do with our weapons. And now they had the weapons, and they were taking them to a private research station, and they believed they had everything they needed. They believed the danger lived in the hardware. They were wrong. The danger had never been in the hardware. The danger was in the gap between having something and understanding it. And they were walking directly into that gap with 47 crates and no idea of what waited on the other side of it. 6 months after the compliance deadline, I was sitting at my instruments listening to a weapon being fired that had no reason to exist. My name is Commander Kate Harlow. I ran the Human Intelligence Listening Post at Faro Station, positioned in the navigational gap between Council space and the outer reach. 11 crew members, persistent problems with the secondary atmosphere processors, and a coffee resupply that had been running 6 weeks late for 3 consecutive rotations. What the station lacked in comfort, it provided in signal coverage. From Faro Station, I could hear a great deal of what moved through that region of space, including things the Council did not know we were positioned to receive. What I was hearing that morning was a railgun, or something that wanted to be one. The energy signature was familiar the way a song is familiar when someone plays it in the wrong key. The core frequency band was correct. The power curve was recognizable, but the capacitor discharge cycle was running approximately 4% slower than specification, and the thermal bleed in the barrel was higher than the design permitted. These were not manufacturing variations within normal tolerance. These were the errors of a system built from a blueprint by someone who understood the blueprint, without fully understanding the engineering history that had produced it. I ran the comparison against our weapons database 3 times. The signature matched the M990 magnetic rail accelerator, a human-designed system that had been in the surrender manifest 8 months earlier, and that was, according to the official record, resting in a neutral archive. It was not resting in a neutral archive. I pulled my historical signal records going back 3 months and worked through them from the beginning, looking for similar anomalies. The scope of what I found over the following 4 hours was larger than I had prepared myself to encounter. 4 test sites, 4 separate locations in Council space, 4 independent development programs, all drawing from the same source material. The Veldorian site was the most developed. Their M990 copy was functional and generating consistent discharge signatures, though the calibration drift I had identified meant the barrel temperature was running significantly high. The effective operational life of the weapon was going to be substantially shorter than the original specification intended, and the engineers at this site had run at least 20 test cycles without catching the drift. An experienced human weapons technician would have caught it in the first cycle. The second site was in Thuresi territory and was generating blast signatures consistent with fragmentation device testing. The yield curves were close to the specification but wrong in a specific, consistent way. The dispersal pattern told me the casing material was not behaving correctly under the thermal conditions of detonation. The alloy was too rigid. It was not fragmenting along the intended pathways. The effective radius was smaller than designed, and the pattern was irregular. Under most controlled test conditions, this would produce a result that looked acceptable. Under specific environmental or operational conditions, the casing behavior would become unpredictable in ways that the incomplete specification would give no warning about. A third site, triangulated to the outer Thuresi administrative zone, was producing kinetic impactor test signatures with a targeting delay that had no place in the design. 0.3 of a second, small enough to miss in casual review, large enough to make the system unreliable in operational conditions. The engineers had built the physical mechanism correctly and had entirely missed the firmware calibration parameters the human specification accounted for. because those parameters were embedded in a section of the documentation that read as background data rather than critical operational variables. The fourth site was the one I found most interesting because I could not immediately identify it. The energy signature suggested someone was using human weapon principles as a foundation for building something of their own design. They were getting parts of it right and other parts wrong in ways that told me they understood the theory and were still learning the practice. Of all four programs, this one was the most honest about what it actually was. I filed a detailed report on all four sites, 31 pages, everything documented clearly, marked urgent. The standard channel processed it on a standard timeline. I filed a follow-up 2 weeks later, noting that the Theresi fragmentation test site was increasing its testing frequency and appeared to be approaching a demonstration or operational readiness milestone. This was a concern, because increasing the yield on a device with a casing material behaving unpredictably under thermal conditions was not a combination with a wide range of possible outcomes. Another standard acknowledgement. On a morning when I was reviewing the overnight signal data, my instruments registered an event from the Theresi site that was not a test. The energy release was 6 times the magnitude of any previous signature from that location. The thermal profile that followed was not consistent with a planned detonation. The dispersal pattern was wrong in the specific way dispersal patterns are wrong when a device functions in a manner nobody nearby was prepared for. I opened a priority channel to Earth Command immediately. I told them I believed there had been an uncontrolled detonation at an unauthorized Theresi research facility. I told them the cause was almost certainly the casing alloy issue I had been documenting across the previous months. I gave them my casualty assessment, and I was not optimistic in it. Earth Command came back 20 minutes later. The Theresi had filed an emergency incident report with the Council. 3 research engineers dead. The official statement attributed the event to a laboratory power failure. It was not a laboratory power failure. We both knew exactly what it was. I told Earth Command that this was precisely the scenario my filed reports had outlined. I told them the Veldorian site was still running an operational weapon with a progressive calibration problem that would eventually produce a comparable result if left unaddressed. I told them the other 2 sites were at various stages of development with their own unresolved technical risks sitting quietly inside their test data. Earth Command asked for my recommendation. I had been building toward this recommendation for 3 months. I had written it in my head during long, quiet watches when the instruments were steady and the signal records were slowly completing their picture. I had turned it over and looked at it from every direction, and I kept arriving at the same place. We send a diplomatic team, I said, not to issue accusations, to have a conversation. We go to the Council and we tell them that a mistake was made and that we can help correct it, and we offer to help correct it fully. Earth Command asked about leverage. I said the evidence itself was the leverage. 8 months of documentation, the manifest discrepancy from the original transfer, the test signatures from 4 independent sites, and the incident data from this morning. We did not need to threaten anyone with any of it. We needed to set it on the table and wait. People sitting with that evidence in front of them, people who understood what it meant, would make the correct decision without being pushed toward it. A longer pause than the previous ones. Then, build the brief. We will handle the team assignment. I sent them everything. Every report, every signal capture, every analysis, every margin note from every late hour I had spent watching a pattern become clear. 6 months of quiet work from a small station at the edge of Council space, compiled and transmitted in one long file. 3 people were dead because someone had moved too quickly from having a blueprint to using it. In a way that was painful to sit with, that was the most familiar story in human history. We had done exactly the same to ourselves, many times. Across many centuries, Every time technological capability moved faster than the wisdom to use it carefully. The difference was that we had eventually closed the gap. We had built the understanding into the system itself, layer after layer, so that the blueprint carried the lessons of every failure before it. That embedded understanding was the thing no copy could capture. That was the thing we were now positioned to offer. I closed the channel and sat in the quiet of Faro Station, listening to the instruments, looking out through the small viewport at the stars holding still the way they always do when something important has just changed. The conversation that was coming was going to be complicated. It was going to be tense and uncomfortable for everyone in the room. But it was going to work because we had learned to wait and to speak slowly and to let the weight of evidence do most of the work. That skill had been built over a long time, too. The session was scheduled to begin at 9. I arrived at 7 because I wanted to be in the room before anyone else walked through the door. My name is Ambassador Colin Drake. I had spent 16 years as a soldier before moving into diplomatic work, which my colleagues sometimes found unusual and which I personally found entirely natural. Diplomacy and military service have more in common than is comfortable to acknowledge. Both require you to know exactly what you have, exactly what the other party has, and precisely how much of what you know should be revealed, and in what order, and at what moment. The difference is that in diplomacy, the damage caused by showing your hand too early is measured in years rather than minutes. The current situation required very careful sequencing. I had been briefed on the full scope of the case 3 weeks before the session. I read Kate Harlow's Signals intelligence reports twice, in full. I read Dion Achterberg's vault logs 3 times. I read the original assessment Mara Voss had filed the day she left the Grand Convocation Chamber, and I understood immediately what she had seen in that room that nobody else had caught. Not an ending, a beginning. She had looked at the moment of forced compliance and seen the shape of what the council was going to do next, because she understood what happens when something frightens people. They do not stop wanting it. They just start trying to get it more quietly. Before the formal session, I held private meetings with the lead delegates of every species whose test programs appeared in the intelligence record. I want to be precise about the tone of those meetings, because the tone was the most important element of everything that happened in them. I walked into each room. I placed a folder on the table in front of me. I did not open it, and then I spoke for approximately 20 minutes about human history. I talked about an English farmer named William Crane, who had lived 400 years before humanity reached the stars, in a settlement on the eastern coast of a continent that had access to weapons technology that neighboring communities did not. One season, a neighboring settlement acquired a version of those weapons through trade, without the full working knowledge behind them. By spring, 3 people in that community were dead in an accident that had nothing to do with conflict and everything to do with incomplete understanding. I talked about the development of explosive chemistry in the medieval period and what happened consistently to groups who encountered it and tried to use it without the underlying principles. I talked about the mid-20th century and the accidents at facilities where nuclear knowledge transfer had been rushed or incomplete, and the specific, documented pattern of what follows when capability moves faster than comprehension. I talked about how this pattern repeated across every culture and every century, regardless of how intelligent or careful or well-intentioned the people involved were. Power without complete understanding produces the same result every time. The only variable is the scale. By the time I finished, the folder was still closed, and every delegate across the table was looking at it with an expression that told me, without the folder needing to be opened, that they understood what it contained. I told each of them that the formal session would begin at 9, and I hoped to see them there with their full delegations. I wished each a good morning. The emergency session chamber was smaller than the grand convocation chamber, but had the quality of a space that had hosted a great many difficult conversations over many years, worn in the good sense. A room that knew what it was for. The delegates filed in before 9, which was unusual, and settled without the normal ceremonial adjustment period, which told me the private meetings had produced the intended effect. No one was making conversation. The room had the quality of a space where everyone had already decided to be serious before they arrived. Shenvoth was in the presiding chair. He looked at me when I entered. I nodded. He nodded back. He had been quiet throughout his private meeting in a way I read as genuine comprehension rather than resistance. When everyone was seated, I stood up. I did not open a folder. I did not project any display. The evidence had already been presented privately, and everyone in the room understood what it contained. The function of this session was not to establish what we knew. The function was to decide together what we were going to do about it. I began with a story. I told them about human warfare, not the recent kind they already feared from the reports of the Franklin's performance at Kepler's Reach. I told them about the very beginning, about conflict on foot, with stone and wood, where the only way to understand what worked was to try it against someone who was simultaneously trying to figure out the same problem. About the early development of projectile systems, when the gap between grasping the concept and mastering the implementation cost more lives in the first years than the weapons themselves ever would afterward. About the centuries-long refinement of every system we had ever developed, each revision driven not by inspiration, but by the specific, documented failure of the previous version. I told them that every number in our technical specifications was a surviving number. Every tolerance, every material specification, every calibration parameter in every system they had spent the past 8 months trying to copy had behind it the exact history of what happened when that number was something else. The specifications did not simply describe a weapon. They carried the accumulated memory of everything that had gone wrong before the weapon arrived at its current form. The room was very quiet. I told them that Earth was aware of the programs. I told them we were aware of all 4 sites, aware of the test histories, aware of the incident 3 weeks earlier. I said the names of the 3 engineers who had died slowly, because they deserved to be said by name in a room with the authority to hear them, even if I was reading them from a report and had never met any of them. I let that sit for a moment. 3 people, researchers, not soldiers, people who had been doing exactly what researchers do, working to understand something, inside a program that should never have existed, because the thing they needed to understand had never needed to be kept secret. Then I told them that Earth was not at this table to demand accountability before the full council, or to file a formal violation claim under Resolution 7 Omega, or to use this evidence as the opening position in a legal proceeding. I picked up the data chip and held it up. I told them that on this chip was a complete package, updated doctrine for every human weapons system in the original surrender manifest, full safety protocols with complete operational history, material specifications with the engineering background explaining why each number was what it was, calibration procedures for every system, and the documented failure records that had produced every current standard. Everything the 4 development programs had been searching for, and more, organized and explained and ready to be understood rather than simply copied. I set it on the table. Then I said, "You wanted our weapons. You received the schematics and studied them and built versions of them in secret. And 3 people are dead because the gap between a blueprint and the knowledge behind it is wider than it looks from the outside. We are not here to condemn that. We are not here to punish it. We are here because we recognize the pattern, because it is our pattern too, and because the correct response when someone is being harmed by incomplete knowledge is to offer the complete version." I paused. The terms are these. Earth will provide full technical knowledge transfer for every system in the original surrender manifest. We will provide doctrinal training, safety protocols, and direct consultation access to our weapons engineers. In exchange, you will establish a joint Human Council Military Ethics Commission, with equal representation from all member species and a formal charter defining the responsible use of advanced weapon systems. You will also acknowledge, as a matter of shared record and not as a legal admission, that the copying programs existed and that they violated the agreed terms of Resolution 7 Omega. A final pause. Because the alternative is pretending it did not happen, and pretending it did not happen means we cannot learn from it together, and we have spent too long learning things the hard way to waste a clear lesson. Shenvath spoke first. His voice had the same careful quality I recognized from Mara's recordings of the original session, but something in it was different now, more internally directed, as if he was choosing words to say something true rather than to manage a situation. He said, "You knew, before your captain left this chamber the first time, you knew we would study them." I said, "We had a reasonable expectation." He said, "And you let it proceed." I said, "We complied with a legal resolution. The decisions made with the materials afterward were made independently by your programs. We could observe. We could document. We could not prevent." He was quiet, the three engineers. I said, "We grieve them, and we believe their deaths are the clearest possible argument for why this knowledge transfer needs to happen now, completely and correctly." The chamber held its silence. Shenvath reached forward and picked up the data chip. He turned it between his long fingers, the way a person turns over a decision before they commit to it. Then he set it down in front of him with a deliberateness that felt like a choice being made in real time rather than a procedural action. He said, "The council will need to deliberate." I said, "We are prepared to wait." After the session ended, he found me in the corridor. He walked toward me with the unhurried care of someone who had been holding a question for a long time and had decided the moment to ask it was now. He said, "Did you know, from the very beginning, from the day in the chamber?" I thought about Mara walking out of the Grand Convocation Chamber and telling her aide they had just asked for the instruction manual. I thought about Dionich Terberg standing in a vault watching fabrication-grade scanners, filing reports that came back noted and filed, and keeping every note anyway. I thought about Kate Harlow at the edge of the galaxy, building a picture one signal capture at a time, waiting until the picture was complete enough to act on. I said, "We had a very clear understanding of what you were likely to do." He said, "But you let it happen." I said, "We complied with the resolution. The decisions that followed were yours." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "And if no one had died, if the accident had not happened?" I said, "Then we would have arrived at this table by a longer route. The gap between having something and understanding it does not close on its own. It closes when something makes the gap undeniable. One way or another, you were going to reach the point where you needed the rest of the knowledge. We preferred sooner to later." He looked at me with those pale silver eyes, and I thought I saw something in them that had not been there before. Not just intelligence, recognition, the specific kind that comes when you understand, fully, the complete shape of the situation you have been standing inside. He said, "You are very patient people." I said, "We have had a great deal of practice." He turned and began walking away down the corridor. Then he stopped without looking back and said, "The commission, I believe it will be approved." I said, "I know." He walked away. I watched him go, and I thought that the most complicated part of what had just happened was not the evidence or the argument or the terms. The most complicated part was what came next, the actual work. The long, detailed, unglamorous work of transferring something as large and dense and historically rooted as a weapons tradition to 33 different civilizations, each with their own engineering culture and their own instincts and their own ideas about what made something worth being afraid of. That work was going to take a long time. I was completely prepared to do it. 3 years after the gavel came down in the Grand Convocation Chamber, I was standing on the bridge of a warship that flew no single flag. My name is still Captain Mara Voss. The word still feels like a small joke, because the rank has not changed, but almost everything surrounding it has. 3 years earlier, I was a liaison officer who had signed a compliance form that transferred humanity's weapons archive to a council that feared us. Now I was the human liaison officer aboard the first joint Human Council warship in the history of the galaxy, surrounded by crew from 11 different species, responsible in part for ensuring that the weapons systems aboard this vessel were used correctly by people who were still in the process of learning what correctly meant. The ship was called the GCS Unbroken Accord, which was either an optimistic name or a practical one, depending on how you approached it. I had always liked practical names. The commission had been approved, as Shenvoth had said in the corridor outside the emergency session that it would be. The knowledge transfer program had taken the better part of a year to get right, because transferring the knowledge behind a weapons system is fundamentally different from transferring a set of files. Files are easy. Understanding is not. Understanding requires context and history, and the kind of repeated exposure that only comes from working alongside people who have the knowledge in their hands and in their habits, not only in a database. The Joint Warship Program had been Colin Drake's proposal, submitted during the second round of commission meetings. One ship as a proof of concept, 48 crew from 12 species, operating under a shared command structure, carrying weapons of human design and doctrine co-developed by the new Ethics Commission. Not a symbolic gesture, not a diplomatic display. A working vessel with a real operational mandate. My department was weapons. 8 humans and 7 council crew, 3 Veldorians, 2 Theresi, and a Vreth named Rienvo who had the watchful, geological patience that I associated with either very senior officers who had seen everything or very junior officers who had learned early that observation was worth more than speaking. I eventually concluded Rienvo was both at once, which I found reassuring. Rienvo did not ask many questions. Rienvo observed everything, and occasionally made a single observation that reordered a situation entirely. I had learned to stop what I was doing when Rienvo spoke. The Veldorian ensign in my department was named Sethar, young by Veldorian standards, which is a difficult comparison to translate, but the nearest human equivalent would place him in his early 20s. He was technically excellent. He had completed the full certification program, which was not a short process, and had scored in the top 5% of his cohort on every written assessment. He could recite specifications and explain procedures with a precision that was genuinely impressive. What he was still building was the layer below procedure, the instinctive reading of a situation that tells an experienced weapons officer not just what a system can do but what it should do, and when, and why the timing is most of the decision. That layer cannot be accelerated very far by any training program. It develops through real situations and through the kinds of choices you only learn from making. The situation arrived 4 hours into a patrol in the outer arc of the Reach. We had been assigned to a transit corridor that had seen increasing activity from Vraxi separatist groups over the previous 4 months. 3 civilian freight vessels had been interdicted in the past 6 weeks. The monitoring office had flagged the corridor as elevated risk and sent the Unbroken Accord to make a presence patrol. Visible, deliberate, the kind of thing that tells those who understand force that the corridor is watched and the watching is serious. The contact came back as 11 craft, 3 clusters of small, fast movers and 2 medium displacement vessels that our intelligence database tagged as modified transport hulls running without transponder signals. No transponder in a monitored corridor is a navigational safety violation and a practical announcement of intent. 3 separate approach vectors, spread across the geometry in a way that was not coincidental and was not a navigation clustering issue. It was a formation. Captain Heldwar, our Thuresi commanding officer, was outstanding in that moment. She assessed the contact spread in under 10 seconds and called combat readiness stations, because she saw what the geometry meant before anyone told her what it meant. I was in the weapons bay with Sethar and the rest of the department when the call came through the internal channel. Sethar had the nearest cluster locked within 8 seconds of the station call. Fast. Correct. His hand moved to the firing authorization with the confidence of someone whose training was solid. I said, "Hold." He looked at me. "I have a clean shot. Cluster 1, 3 craft within optimal range." "I know," I said. "Hold, watch clusters 2 and 3. He watched. The 2 lateral clusters were moving on what appeared to be flanking vectors. It looked like the beginning of a standard bracket maneuver, one of the oldest formations in tactical history. Get around multiple sides, force a commitment, hit the angle that gets exposed. But the lateral speed was wrong. They were moving too fast for the angle they were taking if their actual goal was to reach a flanking position. They were moving fast because they needed to be somewhere specific before we fired, and they needed us to fire before they got there. I said, Cluster 2 is going to cut velocity and reposition, probably in the next 10 to 12 seconds. Watch where they anchor. Sethar watched without speaking. 11 seconds later, Cluster 2's forward momentum dropped sharply and they shifted to a tighter approach angle. If we had committed our fire to Cluster 1 when the shot first appeared clean, Cluster 2 would have had a clear path to our drive section while our targeting was occupied. The shot on Cluster 1 was real. It was a good position. It was also exactly the invitation that had been constructed for us. Sethar said very quietly, "Oh." That single word told me more than a detailed analysis would have. He had understood not just what had happened, but why the shot had looked clean in the first place. The deception was well built. The invitation was genuine. The problem was what came with accepting it. I said, Cluster 1 now. Short burst, navigation array on the lead craft. Not the drive system, not the weapons bay. Navigation. The other 2 craft will be forced to brake to avoid a collision with the drifting lead. Use the window that creates. He fired with clean precision. The lead craft of Cluster 1 lost navigational coherence and began a slow drift. The other 2 broke apart to avoid it, exactly as the geometry demanded. Cluster 3 had been timing its approach on the assumption we would be engaged with Cluster 1 for 40 seconds or more, and was now 30 seconds behind its intended arrival at our position. 30 seconds is a very long time when you have trained to use it. The engagement ran 28 minutes from first contact to the point where the remaining craft broke formation and ran. No crew aboard the Unbroken Accord were harmed. The 2 medium displacement vessels took disabling fire and were boarded by our security team for impoundment. The fast craft clusters dispersed. There were people on the other side who needed medical attention, and they received it. And they were going to spend a significant amount of time explaining themselves to the Council's legal authority. It was clean, it was efficient, it was, in the most important sense, correct. Afterward, I sat with Sethar in the weapons bay while the damage assessment teams ran their checks through the rest of the ship. He was quiet, reviewing the targeting record on his console, running backward through the sequence step by step with the careful focus of someone not reviewing for error, but trying to understand the underlying logic. He asked how I had known about Cluster 2. I told him I had not known. I had assessed it as the most likely action based on the velocity profile and the geometry of the current positions. He said, "You were certain enough to hold a clean shot on that assessment." "Yes," I said. "The shot was real," he said slowly. "It was a good position. Taking it would have been technically correct." "It would have been," I said. He thought for a moment, but the situation was larger than the shot. I looked at him. That was exactly right, and he had arrived at it himself, from one engagement, through observation and thought rather than instruction. I said, the weapon is always part of the situation. Every time. You have to hold the whole situation in your mind simultaneously, not only the part where you have an advantage. Because the part where you have an advantage is very often the part someone designed specifically for you to see. He considered this with the focused quiet that I had come to recognize as his version of processing something significant. Then he asked whether that way of thinking could be taught directly, or whether it only developed through doing. I said it was both. Some of it could be taught. The rest came from making real decisions in real situations, including decisions that did not work out, and from understanding afterward exactly why they had not worked, and from carrying that understanding forward into the next situation until it stopped being analysis and started being sense. He asked how long it had taken humans to develop it. I thought about Gerald Howe and the Franklin. I thought about the 14 iterations of the grenade casing before the one that survived into standard use. I thought about the Grand Convocation Chamber 3 years ago, the gavel coming down before I stood, Shenvoth's pale eyes behind the careful diplomatic warmth. I thought about Dionach Terberg walking out of an empty vault and sending 4 words on an encrypted channel. I thought about Kate Harlow at the edge of the Reach, building a picture from signal data across 6 months until it was complete enough to act on. I said a very long time, and we are still learning parts of it. He seemed to find this more reassuring than a confident answer would have been. I think he had expected me to draw a line between what humans had achieved and what he was working toward. Instead, I had told him the truth. The line was not fixed. The threshold moved as you moved toward it, and the moving was the entire point of the process. He asked one more question. He had been trying to understand the concept of suppressive fire since the simulation training, he said. He could follow the technical description clearly, but he kept feeling that there was something beneath the description that he was not quite reaching. I told him to ask it directly. He said, why does it work? Not the mechanism, the reason it works at all. I sat back, I thought about where to start. I started at the beginning. I told him about conflict on open ground before any advanced technology existed, when the only tools available were what a person could carry, and the only tactics available were what could be learned by watching what happened when you tried things against someone who was simultaneously trying to figure out the same problem. I told him about the understanding that must have come in many places and many times, though no single moment of it is documented in any history, that a weapon does not need to hit its target to change the target's behavior, that the anticipation of impact is itself a form of force, that any being capable of thinking about the future will adjust their actions to avoid a future they can predict, and that this predictability is a lever. I told him that suppressive fire was not invented. It was observed. It was the recognition that every being capable of forward thinking is susceptible to the threat of what might happen, and that this susceptibility can be shaped and directed to define the space an opponent is willing to move through. The weapon changes not only the physical situation, but the decision-making of everyone inside it. And the decision-making, I said, is where the engagement is actually resolved. Not the moment of physical contact, the moment when someone decides under pressure what action to take next. He listened to all of it without interrupting, not the kind of listening that waits for a chance to speak, the kind that is genuinely building something from what it receives, layer by layer, testing each piece against the structure taking shape underneath. When I finished, he was quiet for long enough that I began to think he was organizing a question. Then he said something I want to record accurately because I have carried it with me since. He said, every specification in your documentation is a surviving number. Every tolerance and material choice and calibration parameter is a number that lasted long enough to be written down because the versions before it did not. The blueprint is not a description of the weapon. It is the record of everything that failed first. I looked at him for a moment. I said, that is the most accurate description of our weapons archive, I have ever heard from anyone who did not grow up inside that tradition. He said he thought he was beginning to understand why the knowledge transfer mattered more than the hardware transfer. I told him that understanding was most of what the entire 3 years since Resolution 7 Omega had been working toward, and that he had reached it faster than most people who had gone through the full program. He said he thought he had a head start from the engagement, and that real situations teach things that simulations approximate. I said that was also exactly right, and that he should remember that observation for when he was the one running the training program someday. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a tone that was careful but genuinely curious, "Do you think the other species in the commission will eventually reach the same understanding, not the specifications, the reason behind the specifications?" I thought about the Theresi note-taker in Vault Delta 9, lying on a cold floor to photograph a fragmentation device from the most useful angle because he needed to understand it and was willing to be uncomfortable to do so. I thought about Shenvath's question in the corridor, which had not been confrontational. It had been the beginning of something else. The beginning of a different kind of respect, the kind that does not come from being shown power, but from recognizing that someone has knowledge you need and is willing to share it honestly. I said yes, not all at once and not without difficulty and not without making some of the mistakes we made along the way, but yes, they will get there. Curiosity, when it is honest, leads where it needs to go. That evening I stood at the forward viewport of the Unbroken Accord and looked out at the transit corridor, quiet now after the engagement, the freight lanes open again, and the ordinary traffic of the galaxy moving through the space we had just helped keep safe. Owen Hartley, who had joined the Joint Warship Program after the commission was established, and who had turned out to be exactly as valuable in that role as Mara Voss had insisted he would be, came to stand beside me. He had coffee. He handed me a cup without asking, which remains one of the qualities I value most in any aide. He asked what I was thinking about. I told him I was thinking about the day in the convocation chamber, the gavel coming down before I finished standing, Shenvath's voice like cool water over smooth stone, and the pale silver eyes behind the careful diplomatic warmth, and the barely contained hunger in the single word studied. Owen said, "You walked out of that chamber and told me they had just asked for the instruction manual." I said yes. He said, "Was that a plan? Or were you building solid ground under your feet as you walked?" I took a sip of coffee. Outside the viewport, the transit corridor stretched away in both directions, carrying ships from a dozen species through space that human and council crew were now jointly responsible for. I said both. At the same time, plans and solid ground are not usually different things. He thought about this. Then he said, "Do you think it will hold? The commission, the joint program, all of it, long term?" I thought about surviving numbers. I thought about Sethar sitting at his targeting console and arriving on his own at the truth that no training document had told him directly. I thought about the Theresi researchers in Vault Delta 9, so deeply curious that one of them had written everything by hand to keep the notes close. I thought about Shenvath in the corridor, not accusing, not defending, just asking, because he had finally decided that understanding mattered more than the appearance of having already understood. I said, "Yes, it will hold." He asked why. I said, "Because they are genuinely trying to learn, not to copy, not to acquire, not to close a gap in their defensive posture, trying to understand. That is more durable than any treaty. Understanding does not expire." He was quiet for a long time. The ship moved steadily through the corridor. Outside, the stars were where they had always been. Then Owen said, "Was there a single moment when you stopped thinking of this as a standoff and started believing it was actually going to work the way you intended?" I did not answer immediately. I gave it the consideration it deserved. I said it was the moment Sethar described our weapons archive as the record of everything that failed first, because a person who understands that is not going to misuse what the record contains. They understand the cost of each number, the specific weight of each specification, the history of loss and revision and survival that produced each parameter. Understanding of that depth changes the relationship between a person and a tool. It changes what they reach for it to do. That was the only safety mechanism that did not have an exception built into it. Owen nodded. He looked out at the corridor for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "That is a very human way of arriving at a solution." I said we had to arrive there the hard way. Most of the important things we know, we had to arrive at the hard way. That is probably not a distinction to be proud of, but it is an honest one. The viewport held the stars in a long, still frame. The unbroken accord moved through the space between them, carrying everything 10,000 years of human conflict had built and refined and passed forward. And the crew in the weapons bay was learning it piece by piece. And the learning was patient and incomplete and ongoing and real. Not the weapons. The understanding of what they cost, and what they were for, and what each surviving number had lasted long enough to carry forward. That was the instruction manual. That was what we had handed them, eventually on purpose, when they were ready to receive it correctly. And that was the most human ending I knew. We had nearly broken the room before anyone was willing to sit down and talk. By the time they were ready to sit down, we had already set out the chairs. We had been setting out chairs for a very long time.